Hello, my name is Chase Christensen, and today I will be talking about the impacts of race and the disparities in schooling in our society. So, yeah, let's get right into it. So, first, I got a bit of a timeline here. So, we got the history of educational inequality. So, probably one of the most important Supreme Court decisions that played a big role in our nation was Plessy versus Ferguson. Basically, it constitutionally gave the right to have schools be segregated, and this really played a big role in our nation for a long time. The Plessy versus Ferguson case, a man, Homer Plessy, he refused to sit in the car for black people on a train. So this was like the start. This was the start of the transition from the Civil War. And so with the Plessy versus Ferguson, we have the separate but equal, and we all know that it never really is equal. And then this also brought about the Compromise of 1877. So the Compromise of 1877 withdrew all the Southern troops, or all the troops after the Civil War from the South. There was also a period of time after the Civil War where there were these set of laws known as the Jim Crow laws, and these were federal laws like intentionally designed to oppress former slaves, and it was really a tough time, and it was a tough time for African Americans all in so many aspects: schooling, voting, and you name it, and they were oppressed. The next big Supreme Court case was the Brown versus Board of Education, and this occurred in Topeka, Kansas. And here we see the beginning of the integration of schools. There were a bunch of southern states that were, even though they were supposed to be giving everybody equal opportunities, the schools for former slaves were worse in so many ways. They had worse materials, course materials, textbooks, you name it. It was worse than what the white students had. And this was a really big and essential Supreme Court case, and it really led to changes that we'll get into here in a second. So basically, the NAACP challenged public school segregation, and these were some of the main states. So South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, Kansas, and it also helped fuel the civil rights movement. And Rosa Parks, she didn't want to sit in the back of the bus, and if it wasn't for her, who knows where we'd be today. So we got some more laws here implemented to improve equality. So a really big one was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this was meant to end racial discrimination. Yet there was very little legislation in place to help uphold this act. So then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and this was meant to give African Americans the right to vote. And despite them being given the right to vote, they were still oppressed in so many ways, and there were violent strikes, stuff like that, and there were a lot of ways that people could still oppress their vote. There were, and it's like voting to this day is still an issue, and yeah, and it was really tough for them because there were a lot of protests, and yeah, we'll get into it. I'll give you a good example here in the next slide, and then the last act that I want to talk about is the Fair Housing Act. Like companies and banks, like even till this day, they will not give loans to people based on the color of their skin and stuff like that. So yeah, we got Ruby Bridges here. She was the first black child integrated into an all-white school, and I remember being a really young kid. I was maybe like 10 years old, and I was shown this film at school. It's there's a Disney film. It's pretty good. You should go watch it. I'll maybe include a clip here for you guys so you get the idea. But basically, it's a true story about Ruby Bridges, who was 6 years old, and she was like one of the first colored children integrated into one of these all white schools in the South. And the movie, it's a pretty tough movie to watch. It really is. But really from a young age, it really just showed me that being a young kid going to school, I saw what Ruby Bridges had to deal with, and it was really just like, dang, like it's really not fair, And she really didn't. She's a 6-year-old girl, like She shouldn't be treated like she should not be treated like that. It's not on her, and it was just it was a really disgusting movie, but I think it's a good watch. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. And yeah, I'll include a clip here if I can find one. So yeah.
Good morning, Ms. Bridges. I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Al Butler.
But I thought the man from the NAACP was
You're
going to...
being escorted by U.S. Marshals today, ma'am. Wait till I open the door before you get out. We'll get behind you. The two men in the front car will walk in front of you. We'll all go in the building together. Stay between the four of us and do not look back, no matter what happens. Don't look back at the crowd. Move! Get out of the way! Keep them in the middle.
Hold it. Hold it. Up right there.
The governor of the great state of Louisiana says you cannot enter.
Thank you, sir. The President of the United States says that I can.
Let's go, baby.
So for the 3 supplemental articles I looked at, one of them was this article, Everyday Anti-Racism in Education, and it's presented by the American Anthropological Association, if I said that right. But basically they talk about a bunch of things in this article. They talk about the acknowledgement of anti-racism and how a lot of people in our nation don't even acknowledge the fact that racism exists. And they kind of go off on that for a minute. And then they also talk about the importance of the celebration of races. So I think it's essential as well that like people celebrate their heritage and their culture, because it's really important to connect with your roots in one way or another. And also I feel like if you're celebrating like your heritage and your culture, it's also it kind of helps invalidate other people trying to bring you down, and to an extent, or at least personally, because if you're proud of where you come from, really no one really can tell you differently, in my opinion. So I think that's a really essential step in creating equality in our country. And they also talk about the importance of challenging racial inequality. So, you know, every day we make the decision: do we stand up here? Do we stand up there? And what do we speak up for? And I really do think it is important if you see someone being racist, you call them out. You know, because it's really not cool. And yeah, and then another thing they talk about is countering ingrained tendencies, and I found this part really interesting. So they kind of talk about how we have to go against the grain if we ever really do want to reach equality. And so yeah, I have a little general question there. Maybe ask yourself that. What can we do to see growth in these areas, and what are you actively doing to help support those around you and where they come from and stuff like that? So yeah. All right. So the next article I looked at was lower income college students at elite versus state schools, and basically this was an experiment that looked at different social classes and different levels of wealth and where they went to school and the ways they lived. And I think it's really important to recognize that school is so essential in today's society. You need to be educated if you ever want to make it. I mean, yeah, maybe you can get away with doing crypto or something if you're lucky, but you really do need an education in the society we live in today. I thought this article was extremely interesting because it talks about a bunch of things that I witnessed every day. You know, being in college, I see kids who are taking 17 credits because they can barely afford it and they want to get through school a little faster, and then they're stuck in their rooms all weekend like doing homework. And I really did relate to this experiment, and I found it extremely interesting. So yeah, and there's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said about this article, and yeah, let's see what else I wanted to talk about. So yeah, and also if you're lacking funds, like the low income students, it was found that they were more stressed out because they know that a lot is riding on their education, and they're trying to make their entire family proud and make sure they're financially stable for the rest of their lives, stuff like that. All right, so the third article I looked at children in the U.S. and their schooling opportunities, and it talked about one example that was in there was in New York, right? So there's rich areas of New York, poor areas of New York. It's no secret that the people with money are gonna have better schools for their children. So this article really just goes into depth about the importance of education and having a higher paying job. And another thing they look at is the importance of understanding the system, because there's so many steps when you think about it. You need to go to high school, you need to get a high school diploma, you need to go to college and get your bachelor's, and then potentially get your master's or whatever. And if you don't know the steps, or if you miss a step, you're not going anywhere. You're not making it up at all. And so another thing it goes into is the lack of equal opportunities. Like poor schools can't afford the same teachers that like rich schools can. And I think it's really important I think it's also overlooked how important teachers play a role in a student's schooling, because like if a teacher isn't getting paid enough, like odds are they probably really don't care. They don't really care about their students or whatever. And yeah, I think it's really essential to recognize that schools are not equal, and I think we need to do a lot more to make sure everyone is at least given the opportunity to make it out of whatever situation they're in. So yeah, so I had a couple questions I ended up thinking about when I was looking at all these articles, and I kind of wanted to form like somewhat of a solution to like potentially unify this nation and realize the importance of schooling. So so what changes must we make, and where are we headed? So that's what I'm thinking about. So these are some of my questions, like how much can the government step in and really make a change, how much of it is on the people, stuff like that. And it's always a sticky situation. It always gets so sticky as soon as money, school, and like stuff like that gets involved. It really does get tough. So anyways, after looking at all this information and looking at those questions, this is my personal conclusion. So the number one thing is I think it really starts with the family. You need a strong family unit that values education, and a lot of people don't have that. And unless a parental figure values education, I very highly doubt the child is going to value it as well. And I think, in our nation, we, like a lot of kids, they really don't value school. Obviously, there are those kids that do. But, like traveling around, like I've been to third world countries where, they really don't have much. They have like textbooks from the 1980s. And all the children are so enthusiastic to go to school, like whether or not it's just to see their friends, they're there to learn, and they really care about what they're learning. So I really think it stems from the parents a lot. And if we can't even have that, then I don't think any of the other steps that I talk about here really apply. And then another thing I think is that schools really do need to be somewhat regulated on the federal level. Like everybody needs to go to school. And, like granted, like schools in California are going to be different than here. So there are unique situations where states need to say as well. But I think federally there needs to be a bar, and where that bar is. It's always gonna be up for debate. And another thing I think is that schools that are discriminatory in any way really need to be called out here if we ever want to see educational equality. And we really need to make an example out of schools that are still not allowing people in for whatever reason. And that's my presentation. I hope you learned a thing or two. And yeah, thanks for listening.